Welcome to the Stanley Spencer Gallery in Cookham and our summer exhibition, A Brush with History, Stanley Spencer and Modern British Art, which we've done in partnership with Southampton City Art Gallery. We've been delighted to be working with them because this is a brilliant regional museum which has a stunning collection of modern British artists. The gallery was opened in 1939 and it was formed through a couple of bequests. And one of those bequests stipulated that new acquisitions should be advised by the then director of the National Gallery. And it came to be in the 1930s that Kenneth Clarke, the art historian, became director of the National Gallery. And he was a brilliant proponent of modern British art. He wanted to get art seen in the provinces, and he wanted to instill in the British public a great love of this new wave of British art. So as such, he enabled the gallery to buy a stellar collection of modern British works of art. And we have chosen a variety of pictures which give context to Stanley's own work. And some of these artists also studied with Stanley at the Slade. The exhibition opens with Stanley Spencer's time at the Slade. And we have from Southampton alone of Mark Gertler's Rabbi and His Grandchild, which was painted in 1913. Gertler's place at the Slade was assisted by the Jewish Educational Aid Society. He grew up in abject poverty in Whitechapel. And he and Stanley were great students. They won scholarships and prizes, and they were part of this crisis of brilliance, a group of artists that achieved success while still students. This painting is about age and youth. And one day, Gertler met Dora, the young girl in The Butcher, and paid her to sit for him for pocket money. The two sitters never met, and we don't know who the rabbi was. And originally the composition ran down to the rabbi's knees and Dora was seen sitting on his lap, which I think was rather creepy. And in the middle of painting this, Gertler decided to shrink the composition, and I think justifiably, because it works much more effectively that way. Kenneth Clarke also comes to play in our section on the Second World War. He was director of the War Artists Advisory Committee, which commissioned artists to paint eyewitness accounts of their experiences of war. While Stanley was painting the shipbuilding on the Clyde series, his thoughts began to turn to the theme of resurrection, one of his favourites. He painted a series called the Port Glasgow Resurrection series, one of which we have here. Now, this was not painted in Port Glasgow, but is set in the village of Stonehouse in Gloucestershire, where Stanley had been living with his lover, Daphne Charlton, and her husband, George. The Raising of Jairus' Daughter is a triptych, which is a Renaissance format of altarpiece. In the middle, we've got the Raising of Jairus' Daughter, and the two side panels show resurrection scenes, which are set in Stonehouse. The theme of resurrection was really important to Stanley. It was really about a form of reconciliation between humanity. And on the left, we've got friends and family lifting up from beneath the paving stones in Stonehouse. He'd clearly been looking at Fra Angelico's similar scene in San Marco, which he'd been looking at in his little black and white Gowans and Gray art book. On the right, we've got more of a scene in Cookham, with Stanley striding out into the street opposite Ovie's farm, being led by Daphne, his lover, with his ex-wife Hilda sitting behind him. One of my favourite pairings in the exhibition is the portrait of a rat catcher by Gilbert Spencer, Stanley Spencer's brother, and Stanley's portrait of Marjorie Metz, which was painted some 30 years later. I dread to think what Marjorie would have thought of the rat catcher being sat next to her in her own sitting room. It's also interesting because we often think Gilbert being inspired by Stanley, but actually Gilbert's portrait was painted some 30 years earlier, and you can really see how Stanley has used Gilbert's way of composing the portrait many years later. So actually, his younger brother was far more influential on him than we might have realised. The rat catcher is clearly sitting in Gilbert's sitting room. It's a very middle-class interior. Rat catchers were often poor and uneducated. It was a very dangerous job. And he's sitting in a room that is full of middle-class comfort. The fireplace filled with the paper fan suggests that it was painted in summer. And on the mantelpiece are various artistic accoutrements. On the floor, we've got spent matches, and he sits on a very comfortable chair. We have hung together from Southampton William Nicholson's Glade at Midhurst with Stanley Spencer's View from Cookham Bridge. They were both painted in the same year, 1936. And for me, it's incredibly interesting to look at how both artists have painted light. William Nicholson started his career using light in a very plain way, very thick striations of paint. But when he went to Andalusia in the 1930s, he discovered the power of light and began to paint in a very different way. And you'll see with the beautiful dappled effect of light casting through the trees, how he's used very thick impasto paint to create this effect. Stanley uses paint in a very different way, much more detailed, leaf by leaf, blade by blade, but they are both impressive evocations of how light plays on land and water. Interestingly, William Nicholson's painting was bought by Kenneth Clark for £45 for Southampton, so you can really see how important he was for Southampton City at that time. Another of Stanley's contemporaries at the Slade was C.R.W. Nevinson, and they didn't get on at all, but they both later recognised the brilliance of each other's talents. Stanley and Nevinson reacted to the Great War in very different ways, artistically. For Stanley, he wanted to express his feelings of reconciliation and about humanity, whereas Nevinson was deeply affected by his experiences at the front and wanted to express the degradation of humanity, the mechanisation of humanity. We've got on loan from Southampton this beautiful painting from 1915 of Loading Bay at Southampton Docks when he returned from the war. And you can really see the Watercyst influence in his work, these very sharp angles, which makes for an incredibly energetic composition.